Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Today, I'm going to talk through part identification to quality mass production. So let's get started. I'll start with a quick intro on myself. My name is Daniel Baker, and I'm the program manager for plastics here at Endeavor 3D. I've been working in the additive industry for roughly 10 years now, starting my career in materials testing out on the West Coast in a geosynthetics company doing, development and testing of geosynthetic materials. And the last 7 or so years, I've been working in part manufacturing at the different contract manufacturers. Today, I'll present on the part identification and how we move those parts from initial design phases through to full-scale mass production. Just some quick housekeeping on the presentation today. We'll utilize the Q&A box for any questions. I'll get to those at the end of the presentation, and the chat box for any comments during the live presentation here. We do encourage participation, so feel free to raise your hand, ask those questions, and I'll stop and answer. And then the recording will be made available to everyone after the presentation concludes, and we'll send a link via email to those who have registered. All right, so who is Endeavor 3D? What do we do? So a little background on us. We are a full-service contract additive manufacturing business based in Douglasville, Georgia. We are one of the few HP digital manufacturing partners here in North America with multiple MJF 5200 series and metal jet systems. Finally, we offer full suite of finishing via Dimension and a state-of-the-art QC lab. Just a quick note from our company, our commitment to quality, the Endeavor Way. Endeavor 3D is the largest 3D printing contract manufacturing partner in the Southeast United States. We specialize in product design, prototyping, production, quality assurance, and fulfillment services. Endeavor 3D is ISO 9001 2015 certified and is one of the 5 HP digital manufacturing partners in North America. We service a variety of industries, including industrial manufacturing, automotive, aerospace, consumer products, healthcare, and more. All right, let's get started on the presentation today. Quick overview. To understand what it takes to move an additively manufactured part into production, we will first look at how to actively identify parts that are viable candidates for 3D printing, and then we will go over the process of how a selected application gets qualified for production, as it's slightly different from how you would handle a traditional manufacturing process. We'll start really quickly with a poll, so we'll take a quick break here. Just for the people in the chat, what is your experience level with 3D printing? Are you a beginner, knowledgeable, expert, or none, and you're just here to learn? I'll break just for a few seconds for those to answer that, and then we'll continue. All right. So continuing on, how do we identify parts suitable for AM? So the first section, we will look at kind of a broad spectrum of technologies and parts, and then how do we, initially down select that first application that may be suitable for additive. It's a three-phased approach for application selection, in my opinion, and it can be broken down into 3 key themes. The first that we'll go over is an initial assessment of the application and its general features. The second is an in-depth technical validation, reviewing the viability of the part that has been selected for the manufacturing process, and also doing a rough look at the unit economics. And then lastly, we will do a comprehensive business case analysis to determine the economic viability and production feasibility of the parts. So here are a couple questions that we will ask our customers kind of in the discovery phase as we're first looking at an application. The first is, what are the pain points with their existing manufacturing method? Are there issues with high minimum order quantities that you need for a selected production run? Are lead times extended? Do you have supply chain constraints for raw materials, stock components? Do you have certain design features that are desired but you can't achieve through traditional manufacturing? The second question that we'll ask is, what criteria do you need to consider when selecting an additive manufacturing technology? What's most important to you? What's most important to the success of the program? Is it the speed of the production? Is it the material? Is it cost or part capability? And then lastly, what specific finishing criteria are required for your application, such as certain colors that need to be met, part textures, surface finish, engravings. What does your part need to ultimately be an end-use product for the customer? So to start off, I'll go over a few examples and discuss kind of pros and cons with each. We'll take a high-level approach here, and let's consider this O-ring. Some advantages of using additive manufacturing to produce this part could be fast lead times and quick turnaround. Maybe you need it for fit function testing and you just need a part kind of rough and quick. Or you're working on a customized design with non-standard size components. Utilizing additive over cutting a tool could be a good fit. And then lastly, maybe you just need a few pieces and you're working through prototype design. Utilizing additive as a low-cost alternative to sourcing those parts and extending out that design cycle when you just need something really quick. Now, there are plenty of disadvantages with a part like this. It's a relatively simple part. Producing these at scale with additive would quickly become more costly than traditional manufacturing methods. And your piece part unit economics for a small O-ring are likely an order or two magnitudes higher when you compare it to the traditional manufacturing method. Another disadvantage are the materials, right? So you have a very limited material selection when looking at additive to mimic rubber-like or silicone-like offerings. And there's currently a vast catalog available off the shelf that have been produced. As well as, these are commonly available. I could run to the store and get a pack of these pretty quickly. So unless I'm truly in a bind, I think, this is a poor application to utilize additive. Now we'll look at something a little more complex, a little more detail oriented, and we'll take a look at this closed impeller design. Compared to the first example of the O-ring, the closed impeller is significantly more complex, and it will make a better candidate right out of the gate for utilizing additive. Similar to the O-ring, some of the advantages are part lead times and low volume production. However, unlike that first example, one of the main advantages I see for using AM on the impeller design is the design flexibility that it offers. We're able to modify traditional designs, reduce assemblies, create entire parts in one piece rather than, having a need for complex processes such as casting to produce this part. Also, utilizing polymer additive manufacturing, you can lower the cost for those small or mid-volume production runs compared to the way they're traditionally manufactured. And we'll see some of the same disadvantages, such as the limited material offerings on additive. Some other things to consider are tolerances offered through additive manufacturing and the surface finish of an as printed part. Without the aid of secondary processes to either dial in tolerances to achieve the dimensional accuracy you desire, or for that surface finish you desire, you start to slowly creep and increase the cost to produce a viable part. And the impellers are, a pretty popular use case for additive because of that design flexibility. And if the material selection and surface finish on the technology are okay, they're satisfactory, the impeller can be a great candidate for low or mid-volume production runs. Lastly, we're going to look at this gaming controller housing. At first glance, to me, it's a great application for utilizing additive in the prototype and development cycle. You can quickly run through several design iterations in a single day, testing fit, function, without having to go through a traditional manufacturing cycle, which can create a lot of churn and be relatively long. Also, given that it's a consumer good, you're able to modify the designs throughout the life of the product and customize that end-use product without having large minimum order quantities for each variant. This both gives the designer and the end customer a new level of flexibility when working on an application like this. Similar, though, to the first two examples, some disadvantages for this housing would be surface finish, cost at scale, which can be still relatively prohibitive for additive production. And while it's not as straightforward as the impeller, exploring the customization is an interesting way we can, really kind of push this towards additive manufacturing. And we can take a look at those economics and the ultimate viability of producing a housing like this at scale. Quick pause again for our second poll. So for those who answered beginner, knowledgeable, or expert in that first poll, how have you used 3D printing in your line of business? Are you using it as a prototype engine, bridge to production? Are you creating jigs, fixtures, small batch one-off runs? How are you using additive today? All right, I think we got our answers in, so I'll continue. Let's take a deeper dive into that last example. So this is the application that we will look at today, this controller housing. Once we've made that initial determination that this application might be suitable for additive production, we need to start gathering requirements. And this will help us identify, first, is it viable? If so, what printing process is available for those requirements? And there are a few key requirements here on the screen that our customer provided to us, and that's what we'll run through today and how we'll look at the part. This part was brought to us as an end-use customer part that needed to have a smooth surface finish. The customer wanted to explore flexible finishing options. They particularly cared about color, texture, and then the ability to do custom engraving, so adding names, phrases, certain things on the outside surface of this housing. Order volumes were typically small. They were looking at less than 500 units for each type of variant. And it needed to be strong, durable material with some level of flame resistance, given that it's, housing electronics on the inside of this. Given that information, we were able to then look at the available printing processes on the market that are available to us, and then determine what technology we should target for this application. So looking at this chart, it's pretty overwhelming at first glance. There's a lot of information on the screen. And it's only, contains a very small subset of the additive manufacturing processes available in the market. And it's just representative of our specific operation and supply chain network. But as I said, it's overwhelming. I'm looking at it and I see, 7 different options for technologies, each having their own niche, where they fit, what criteria are covered under that technology umbrella. And the additive market's constantly changing. We're seeing new materials, new software, new hardware emerging every year. So it's really hard to have a set technology picked and ultimately move forward with that. So as we look at this chart, we can kind of see the pros and cons of each, and then even deeper within those technology offerings, you have OEMs with specific, materials, advantages, disadvantages that they offer. Some of these technologies prioritize speed of production. Others, focus on extensive material offerings. So looking at this, we can see each one of these technologies offers at least one, if not several of our constraints for the controller housing. For example, if we look at, say, SLA, they offer durable material, smooth parts. However, it has a lower throughput, so it could be a good fit for this application if the MOQs stay relatively small, but maybe cost could be prohibitive there. Now, if we look at DLS and material extrusion, they both have the flame resistant materials. However, you're going to be limited on your secondary finishing options, so customization becomes more difficult. If we look at the middle there on the powder bed fusion, we've got SLS and MJF. Both of these offer flame resistance, high throughput, durable parts. However, the surface finish as printed is relatively rough, so you're not going to get that injection mold-like finish that the customer desired. To identify the best fit, we now have to go back to that requirement list that we just looked at for our controller housing and determine which of these are critical and which ones will give us the ultimate, the best part to ensure program success for our customer. So going back, we'll clarify some of the criteria with our customer and see what is critical for success for this part. After discussion with our customer, it was determined for this application, they really cared mostly about a smooth surface finish, flexible finishing options, so the ability to have engravings, textures, colors, as well as a durable impact resistant material. They were willing to accept a little bit of a trade-off on unit economics, as long as the part remained functional and durable. Now we can go back to that table that we just looked at, kind of narrow down those options and maybe focus in down select on a few select technologies to do a deeper dive on. So before we do that, we'll ask the last poll of the presentation today. Of those options that we presented for this application, which technology do you think is the best fit? So we kind of walked through some of the pros and cons of most of them, and I'll give a few minutes in the chat for you guys to select which which technology you think the application is best suited for. All right, I think we've got some answers in the chat. So looking at this, revisiting our table, we can initially determine, 3 of the technologies maybe are the best suited. So we'll look at vat photopolymerization and powder bed fusion as good fits for this application, since they covered the majority of those critical requirements that we down selected. If we narrow in on the vat photopolymerization, we can look at specifics between SLA versus DLS, and we can kind of quickly rule out SLA for this application as some of the material properties and the throughput on DLS just outperform SLA. So when we're looking at higher volumes, we want that flexibility of material properties and throughput. So we'll kind of eliminate SLA and keep DLS in the running for now, as it offers both impact resistant material, smooth surface finish, and we can achieve custom textures and engravings, even though it may be difficult. And we have limited options for color, but it's still available on the platform. And now both SLS and MJF have been selected as they have impact resistant materials. While they have the rougher surface finish off the machine compared to the vat photopolymerization parts, we're able to utilize secondary finishing to achieve those smooth surface finishes and still give us a wide variety of color options. So that's not a blocker for this application. To further refine our selection, we're going to do a deeper dive into some of the data of these 3 technology offerings and see which one makes the most sense for this application. So using this information here, this is from the 2018 Wohlers report, and they're going to show us how the different technologies stack up against each other in terms of build rate versus volume against machine cost. So looking at this, we're trying to kind of look at unit economics, as we know that's still a priority for our customers. So can we eliminate 1 or 2 of the technologies based on just the unit economics of the part right out of the gate? Using this, we know it's important to determine, the build volume versus machine cost. That's going to tell us how much air we have, how many parts we can produce versus the cost of the machine. The data set on the left is showing us that SLS and MJF rank much higher compared to SLA and DLS for that matter, which have smaller build volumes but a much higher cost. So our throughput on SLS and MJF are going to be significantly higher, providing lower overall part cost. And on the chart on the right also shows that MJF and SLS have a higher build rate, so they print faster. You can get more parts in the same amount of time when you compare it to DLS or SLA, with MJF ranking significantly higher than both of those, which would give us the lowest ultimate unit economics. Continuing, we're going to look at some material properties here. So once again, from the 2018 Wohlers report, we can compare those material properties for MJF and SLS to their injection mold equivalent. For this application, we're focusing on a nylon-based material, which both technologies provide. So both platforms offer similar material characteristics compared to their injection mold equivalent. You can see on the chart, you've got SLS on the left on both, MJF on the right. So MJF outperforms slightly, but it's not enough to kind of lean us in any given direction. So with all of that information, we ultimately decided to move forward with pursuing MJF just because it had the improved unit economics and they had comparable material properties compared to SLS. So the second part of that 3-phase approach that we went through is the technical validation. So now that we have selected a technology in MJF, we need to validate and verify that it can meet all of those requirements for the given application. The first and most critical is determining if the part indeed is even printable, or do we need to do some level of DFAM or redesign to make it viable. Some of the questions that we'll ask are, does it fit within the build platform of the printer? Are the walls too thick? Are they too thin? Are there certain areas that are risk for warp when using MJF to print this part? Do they have any features that are too small to resolve, given that it's a powder bed process? You've got some limited capability on feature sizing. So does everything really fit within that technology sphere? And can we make a good part without redesigning it? And then the second question that we'll ask are, what secondary processes are required to achieve that end use part? And are those now secondary processes compatible with not only the process that we selected, but the material selection that we've made as well. This slide is going to show us the factors that really affect the variability. So what we're showing here is that there are many factors outside of just the part file or design that really determine the final part quality in a production environment. While the raw material data may be provided from our OEM or through our own internal testing, physical testing has to be performed to ensure that the combination of geometry and the printing process still yields those desired performance results on the MJF process. Second, the MJF process creates significant localized thermal effects during printing and cooling. These effects have to be understood to minimize the risk of defects such as warp or elephant skinning during the printing process. As in many manufacturing processes, there's a certain amount of variability in the hardware itself. So that has to be accounted for and controlled to ensure the material properties are being achieved, tolerances are being achieved, and then consistency printer to printer, part to part is being achieved. Lastly, the orientation of the part in the build, how we set up that build, how densely it is packed, will have significant impact on the quality of the part as well as the unit economics. We'll have to look at a trade-off between those two, and we have to really balance those as we look to move this into higher volume production. So similar to that last slide, we're showing there's more than just the design that go into making a part. There's a ton of factors and variability that really go into that funnel, and then ultimately you're creating the end use part. First, it's the mechanical properties. So how are we understanding the mechanical properties of the printed part? Not just the raw material, but the part as it's been printed and processed. We're doing a lot of secondary processing to this part. So how do we ensure that those mechanical properties stay true throughout all of that? We're controlling for those thermal processes, as we mentioned on the last slide, the differences from printer to printer, the post-processing, which is important. As mentioned, they want, custom engravings, custom colors on this part. So how does, effective painting or dyeing, what does that do to the durability of our part if we're putting it through certain heat treatments or heated baths or vats for dyeing? Is that affecting the end use quality of our part? And lastly, the simulations for the print file itself to make sure it runs smoothly and consistently over time. So we'll go into the nesting phase, as it's really the first step in the process. Before you can create a part on the MJF platform, you have to put it through an orientation and a nesting algorithm to nest those parts within a build. And then these images are showing you 3 different versions of that part orientation or nesting. The first option on the left, which I will call simple nesting, all of the parts were just imported as designed from CAD with no consideration for surface finish or nesting density. So customer sent us a file. It was designed in this orientation. We did not modify it. We did not move it. We just put it into the build box and then let those nest. That resulted just under 70 parts per build. And there was really no engineering done. There was no consideration for the surface finish or quality of the part. It's just as printed. So it's likely not the solution to be used. It's kind of the quick, dirty, fast solution. Maybe if you needed one part just really quickly, there wasn't a lot of thought into the process, this is how you would produce it. The second two are a little more compelling. So in the second option, which I've called optimal density, we have now optimized for the unit economics. So the part orientation varies from part to part. And this is used to optimize that packing density to get the maximum number of parts possible within the bounding box of our printer. And while it has the highest throughput, parts may have variable surface finish. You might see different artifacts or print lines on the parts from part to part, as well as significantly different dimensional accuracy as the parts are printed in different planes and different orientations. So you're trading off a little bit of quality for a little bit of unit economics. And then the last option, which I was calling quality optimized nesting, the parts are carefully angled to optimize the surface finish and the dimensional accuracy on key features. This is the most balanced approach as it aims to optimize throughput without sacrificing the part consistency. So if we look between options 1 and 3, we have significantly more parts in the build volume, so we lower our unit economics. However, they're all controlled, they're all uniform, so all of the parts should act the same way once they come out of that build box. And if we're comparing 2 to 3, again, you're only gaining unit economics or cost benefit in the optimal density, but you're sacrificing some of that quality. For the finishing option, so we talked about that being a critical piece that goes into making that final part. This slide is showcasing just one of many finishing options for HPMJF parts. It happens to be the tools that I currently use in my factory and that I have access to. So for the controller application, using equipment from DyeMansion was sufficient for us. You can fully depowder and surface process all of your parts. We have the vapor fuse the parts and get that smooth injection mold like finish, as well as the DM60 for full color for full color options via dye. We have a full suite of dye that's available. As we print the parts, we're able to print, depowder, vapor smooth, dye, and then ultimately surface process on their PowerShot S. So this was sufficient for our application. We were able to achieve everything that we needed, so we moved forward. And now on the business case side, the last piece of the puzzle, here are a couple questions that we will ask our customer on the business side. The first is, what are the unit economics? And are there, certain minimum order quantities that they are currently having to meet utilizing traditional manufacturing? And how can we offset that by augmenting additive into the product lifecycle? It's important to determine where that cost break even is for them. So say they're injection molding this currently, where's the break even for producing this, as the additive part itself, the piece part price, is likely going to be higher in most cases than the traditional manufactured. When you think of everything such as the tool cost and all of the upfront engineering, any kind of change, any kind of development, you can really start to offset those costs by using additive for the low, mid to even high volume production runs. And then lastly, we need to determine for each application, what will the end product become? Is it full production on additive? Are we looking just to bridge to tooling? Are they looking at this as a kind of a quick fix, a few months to run while the tooling is being spun up? Or do these parts fulfill the end of life for a production program? So going through each of those 3 nesting scenarios that I showed before, we're going to look at a business case and some of the cost drivers for that. So the first, for that simple nesting, you're getting a unit cost of around $30 a part, with the main cost drivers, which will be consistent throughout, being the bounding box, the nesting density, material consumption, and build time. So looking at this, again, we knew going in this was not a great fit. We would not move forward with this, but it just goes to show, without some of the considerations for additive processes or DFAM or design of even the nesting box, you get low unit economics, which could really turn you off of using additive as a production application. The second, we're going to look at that optimal nesting density. We see a huge reduction in cost, going from $30 to $19 a unit. However, we're not optimizing for quality and print defects. So we'll need to look at the unit economics of that quality optimized build to determine if it's worth, a slightly higher unit cost to achieve higher quality on the back end. So moving forward, we go to that quality optimized, which is around $22 a unit. So you see a small jump from the optimal density nesting. And ultimately, it's the customer's decision at this point. Are they willing to sacrifice a few dollars per unit to achieve a higher quality, more consistent quality, and tighter dimensional accuracy for each part? We ultimately move forward with that quality optimized, and using that information, we were able to then look at a cost analysis between the injection molded part and the MJF part. Simple math here. We took the cost of the tool and the unit economics on the injection mold side, and then we stacked that against the piece part price of our MJF components. Looking at this, the break even was around 1,000 units. 1,025 was the exact break even, where the piece part price of HP started to surpass that injection mold upfront cost of creating the tooling. And so we recommended using MJF for bridge production on these, which was anything under 1,025 units, which fit perfect into the customer's use case of around 500 units for each variant of their design. All right, now we'll move to the second half. So we've, at this point, we've decided on an application, we've down selected a manufacturing process, we've validated that the finishing and secondary processes are required for that application, as well as the unit economics make sense on the scale that we're trying to produce the part. So then how do we go about qualifying these parts for AM production? The first step in the qualification process is we need to lay out all of the variables and determine what variables need to be controlled, who controls those. Is it the OEM? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the end customer? And then where do those fit kind of in the life cycle of this part? So looking at this simplified process flow, we can see that there are many additional steps required outside of just that printing process. The OEMs play a critical role in this, but the majority of that control falls outside of the printing process, which would then fall to the manufacturer and the end use customer. So if we look at this workflow here, we've got the order creation on the front end, print design and verification, optimization, production scheduling, build prep, all of that falls on the manufacturer side. So us at Endeavor 3D, we would take that, we have to control each of those processes individually before the part even gets to the printer. And then you've got thermal processing, which is really a split control. So the OEM here, in our case, we had HP parts, they're in the cooling units, while after the part has been printed, it goes through that cooling process. While HP's hardware controls for some of that, the engineering at Endeavor also need to control for the orientation of the build and how that thermal processing will work to ensure we're not warping parts or removing parts too quickly from that powder. You've got post-processing, which is all of the equipment that I showed from Dimension for this specific piece. And then we have our quality and packing and shipping on the back end. So for the controller application, we'll work through like the HP example here. So the first step that we talked about controlling is that design for additive. So it's, there are a number of features you can control on the design side, whether it's reduction of assembly, whether, certain features of the part, maybe there's an interior lip. This specific part on the back end, there are blind holes that trap powder. So we had to design that for cleaning, whether that's, using a sacrificial piece to remove that powder or opening up those holes, creating an area for the powder to be removed on the back end. How do we control for that warp? As I mentioned, is it the ultimate shape of the part? Is it certain thicknesses? Wall thicknesses throughout can really determine where that part will warp or not warp. The second is that build nesting. So looking at that packing density, you have to optimize for heat in the build as well as unit economics. How close can the parts be together, without damaging your part, damaging your reusable powder? How much can I get into that build without sacrificing any level of quality? The third, material supply. So that's the formulation of the powder itself, the binder itself, and then how we're packing the hardware and handling that on our shop floor. The printers, that's going to be all of the hardware within the printer. So you've got thermal calibration, you've got a lot of mechanical parts moving back and forth that require maintenance. So we have to ensure that as we're doing this production run over the course of a number of weeks and months and years, that print to print, printer to printer, all of those machines are operating in the same manner. Same for the processing station. So that's how we cool our part. That's how we pack our powder. So how do we control for all of the moving pieces within that specific hardware itself? Post-production, this is where the manual aspect and some automation comes in. How are we controlling for depowdering? At Endeavor 3D, we've chosen to automate the majority of that process, rather so kind of take that human component out, remove that variable. But how do we control that each part is getting depowdered in the same way for the same amount of time, and that there's no powder left behind after cleaning that part? Same for all of the other secondary finishings for vapor smoothing, dyeing. If you have any secondary assembly, how are you controlling for each piece of that puzzle? And then lastly, the metrology. How are we ensuring that we're inspecting these parts and that parts are coming out the same way each time? And if there is any change, what does that loop look like to get that corrected and create a corrective action to ensure that we're moving forward, we have dimensionally stable parts. All right, now that we have an idea of what process controls look like and kind of what steps are there, now we need to define the process a little further. And we can move to validating the process for production. So moving it out of development and just test pieces, and kind of moving it towards closer and closer to that locked production run. So this will take that theoretical process and put it to the test, with the end result showing that the process is not only capable, but it is repeatable for mass production. So back to our controller housing example, we can start to see some of the data and how our part printed as is on the MJF process. So we ran these parts at Endeavor, and a process engineer created the builds, optimizing for the quality as mentioned. And there were 100 samples in total printed of this part as our first run. So we had 50 parts produced across 2 different printers, and then a full first article inspection was done on all of those parts. As we see, we had about 10 unique dimensions that we measured, showing on the screen. I've got 4 data points here. Only 2 of those 4 were within our spec. So you see our upper and lower spec limits. 2 of those dimensions fell outside of that. The variance was just slightly too high on the dimensional side. And so how do we go about changing that at Endeavor 3D? We now know we have 2 dimensions on our parts that are slightly variable, and we need to lock and control those. So using that information and the feedback from the manufacturing process, we were able to augment the production to get a better control for those specific dimensions. A number of factors were considered, but ultimately it was that part orientation that needed to be modified to control for the specific features. So from dimension 2 and 4, they were oriented significantly in the Z in our build box, and we rotated the parts about 4 degrees, which then gave us a tighter tolerance in the XY, which gave us a more repeatable, more accurate part in the long run. And we also sacrificed no unit economics, as it was the same number of parts per build. So from there, we've repeated that exact same process. So 2 printers, 50 parts each, 100 total parts were produced. A first article inspection was done, and then we determined that our parts were reliable, and we could move forward with production with just the sampling plan to ensure that the parts were repeatable over time. So to summarize that kind of data that we just explored, our approach to ensure part quality begins and ends with the data. Utilizing the feedback from the machine and the printing process, we were able to determine the root cause for production issues, which drove design of experiments to correct those issues. We adjusted the process to improve the accuracy and repeatability. And then lastly, we locked the process and monitor it throughout the production life cycle. And I think that's a key takeaway here, is once you have determined the process is reliable and repeatable, it's how do you go about controlling that and locking it in the additive environment. Typically you're used to additive being a number of parts. Any number of parts can go within a certain build volume. You can just run those parts with any parts that come in or out of the process, as you're not changing the part itself. However, it's that holistic environment that needs to be locked and controlled to ensure repeatable, accurate production. And so an example of how we do that, and here's our kind of a run through of our MES, our internal MES that's been developed for our additive. So all of the parts are input into our system at the design phase, and it's tracked through all aspects of our operation: design, quoting, sales order creation, batch ticket or router creation, quality, as well as fulfillment. So looking at the snapshot above, you can kind of see each batch ticket is given a unique identifier that is a link back to all of the design iterations that have been run for the designs, as well as all run of parts that have been completed. So if you've put these parts across 5 different builds, we can trace that back to each of those 5 builds to know where that part lived within any one of those. And once these parts are validated and approved by our quality organization, those become what I call locked builds, which can be pulled time and time again for repeat production. However, you cannot modify them. So in the example of the controller housing, we've got the 89 parts within a build volume. We're running that part. I can no longer move those parts, add additional parts, change materials, change post-processing. All of those are locked, and nothing can be modified unless you have to go back and have quality approval, a design of experiment done, and then you change the orientation like we saw from the 2 different first articles that we looked at. What this does is it ensures that, no matter if it's part number 1, part number 10,000, all of our parts are going to be produced in the same way, in the same orientation, with the same processes. And lastly, we'll look at the part approval process, or phase 3 of this approach. So the last piece of the puzzle here is to move a part from conception and prototype to higher volume production. And we need to run through multiple qualification processes or activities here. There's really two areas of focus. The first being supplier qualification, which is fairly standard, and there's nothing unique to additive, I would say, on this side. But we look at our supply chain and we review the business case with our customer. We're assigning the resources needed from both sides, so from both organizations, that the entire production program is resourced properly. We perform an in-person site visit to get the customer familiar with our operation. And a lot of the time it's familiar with the technology, as it's new for a lot of our customers. And then the majority of those times, a formal audit of our quality systems and QMS will take place. At that point, we become onboarded as a certified vendor for these specific components that we're producing. We'll establish lead times and delivery schedules, and then determining any ongoing continuous improvement activities, as well as critical inspection requirements required. The second thing that we want to consider are part-specific qualification activities. So these will vary application to application, but it's a fairly standardized workflow for our internal process. The first is we'll set those MOQs and volume thresholds for the manufacturing process selected. So in that HP example of the controller housing, we looked at the nesting density of the part to determine the optimal build range and quantity for the parts, and what makes sense for us operational. So what kind of delivery schedule can we be on based on the number of parts produced in any given build. We need to establish the acceptance criteria and the critical features for those components. Complete the trial run in the first article, capture all of that data, put that back into our system, and then modify the run as needed. We will then obtain approval from our end customer and lock the design, as well as locking the build files in the final batch ticket. And then lastly, we want to establish a control plan to ensure ongoing part repeatability and quality in the future. And to sum up all of these quality aspects, we'll talk through the 3 different types of production that we see at Endeavor and kind of how we think about them. So the first is that high volume production. So this is high volume, low variability, where we would kind of view this similar to what you would think of in traditional manufacturing, where there's minimal change in either your part geometry or your build process. We have a fixed process that has, very few variables in it. For these applications, we would recommend going through a standard PPAP or part approval process. The second type of production that we see is what we'll call on-demand production. And this is your lower volume, higher mix type of parts. These parts are typically locked, however, the builds they go into are variable, or they'll see some level of variability. This makes it harder to qualify for production. However, the approach that we take for applications like this is from a high quality standpoint. So we would rather err on the side of higher quality than higher risk. We perform first articles on all of these parts, and then a generous ongoing sampling plan for parts on each build to ensure that our quality is upheld. So we have, based on our ISO standard, we take a number of parts from each build that is produced, and we do measurements on all of those parts. And then lastly, we'll have what I'll call prototype and customized design. This is high volume, high variability. So in the instance of our controller housing, this is kind of where we live, where there's constant change in either the design or the post-processing. These are looked at on a part-by-part basis. So typically there's an acceptance range that is determined with the min-max bounds. And then we offer 100% inspection for some applications if it's needed, with a wide variety of our laboratory tools. So whether that's hand tools and using go, no-go gauges, or all the way up to fully scanning, 3D scanning every part that comes out the door. We'll look at those on a case-by-case basis. And that's all I got for you today, guys. I'll take some questions now. I think I saw a few pop up while we were running through. Let me grab those. All right, so the first question I have is, what challenges did you run into after the first prototype run on the housing, and how did you go about solving that problem? So I talked through that a little bit with the orientation and how we changed that to ensure the quality. But actually the very first parts we ran before we were doing full builds of these, we ran into significant issues with the warp of the part. So it's a relatively thin design. It's got a higher aspect ratio and it's got some complex features. So when we ran this part for the first time, we had it in a vertical orientation. And what we saw is once we pulled it out of the powder, it had curled just slightly. And while these are being installed into a greater housing, like that warp could have been fixed. We knew if we were looking at making several thousand of these, as well as doing them on a customized scale, that we needed to fix for that. And that's where we ultimately landed on that quality optimized orientation that you saw on the slide. Another question is, what software did you use to customize these pieces? So there's a number of softwares used on the design side. I think that's a little less relevant. On the nesting side, we used Materialize Magics to create those nested builds, as well as they have a serialization tool that you can use to fully customize. And we can do that from build to build or part to part. How many units have you made? Has the customer transitioned to injection mold at this point? Or are you still producing these at scale? We've made several thousand of these. The customer has not transitioned to injection molding, as the customization actually is proven significantly more viable for them. So being able to, offer that as a service and add, custom colors, as well as the ability to engrave whatever you would like onto the surface of the part, has really proven to be a hit. So we're still producing these today. I think that is it for questions. If there's any more, I'll give it maybe a minute or so in the chat. Feel free to post them up and ask. And if not, we can conclude. All right, looks like that's all the questions. So I'll leave you guys with a thank you. Again, my name is Daniel Baker, and there's my contact info. If you have any questions or any parts you want us to look at, feel free to reach out. Thanks, guys.